gonna ask you a question. Have you ever heard the concept or cliche, fear as a motivator? Like somehow fear helps us to be better or in life. And I remember growing up hearing this from parents, teachers, coaches, neighbors, and I really never quite bought into it. Now, when you think about how we respond to fear, fear has 4 responses: fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, which is basically doing nothing. And as I got older and watched fear manifest negatively in people's lives, I began to question it more. I thought, what if there's a 15-minute talk that maybe helped us look at fear across our lifetimes, maybe to understand it better? Today I say to you, fear alone is not your motivation, but instead should be the desire to move through it. I'll give you an example. When I was 5 years old, my mother would take me to the park to feed the ducks. She would always bring an almost finished loaf of Wonder Bread, my favorite, and would instruct me to tear pieces off and throw them to the ducks, and so I would. Well, on this day, the ducks were a little assertive, more aggressive than usual, and the next thing I know, they are all running toward me. Now, my mother was only about 30 feet away, but her mom sense went up, and she turned to me and said, "Run, baby!" So my little 5-year-old legs start to run. Next thing I know, she swoops me over her shoulder and we're running toward the car. She's yelling to me, "Throw the bread, throw the bread." Now I'm 5. And she's also told me not to waste food. So I'm confused and I freeze. We get to the car, she dives in like we're 2 Charlie's Angels, rips the bread out of my hand, throws it out of the door before closing it shut. And there were ducks all over the car. This was fear. Oh yeah. And today, I am not a fan of random wildlife and unbridled nature. Going to the zoo, perfectly fine. Everybody's barricaded. Going on a nature walk, it depends on the nature. Open oceans and safaris, I want no parts of it. Don't need it in my life. And now you're probably thinking about a childhood animal nemesis or 2 you had. We all had them. It's okay, I feel you. But as we approach this important topic of fear, I have a bit of a disclaimer. I am not a therapist. I'm a Black woman who loves my family and friends, STEM trained at this great institution, and life raised. I believe I'm an optimist, an observationalist, my word, a pragmatist, which all rolled together makes me a realist. And listen, this talk is my public service announcement to you that fear is not the motivation you want in your life, and how self-awareness and courage and community can help get you through it. Fear is an unpleasant emotion caused by the belief that something bad is going to happen, something dangerous. And motivation are the reasons why we do things. It drives our behaviors and actions. And for far too long, we've combined these 2 words and creating a false belief that fear helps us, and we don't think about the damage it could cause. Our primitive brains are hardwired like a security system. And today, in our 24/7 digitally connected world, fear is more igniting to and less tolerant of the fears we have. The world is more igniting to and less tolerant of the fears we have. Fear can happen in a moment, or it can linger on for your entire lifetime, and it will definitely cloud your judgment. So my message is simple. I want you to figure out what your fears are as early as you can in life so that you can address them and live more of the life you want. Carl Albrecht, a PhD, in March 2012, wrote an article for Psychology Today naming the 5 fears all humans experience. Number 1, fear of extinction, I will die. Number 2, fear of mutilation, I will lose a part of my body. Number 3, loss of autonomy, I will lose my freedom. Number 4, separation, I will lose someone or something I love. Number 5, ego death, I will lose my relevance. Here's what fear might look like in childhood. When I was 8 years old, I had a nightmare one night and dreamed that my mother died. And I sprung up in the bed, already crying, confused and scared. And for some reason, I didn't go to her room, which was right next door, like I normally would after a nightmare. I just stayed there in bed with my own 8-year-old tears and thoughts and never told her about it. And when I was 12, she did die. And it was sudden and tragic. And to this day, the most horrible thing that has ever happened to me. And then I wondered, did I jinx myself? Because you're 12. That's what you think, right? She was a single parent. I was an only child, so I knew exactly what her dying meant. It meant in that moment, there would never be anyone in my life who I was their number one, to love me unconditionally ever again. And so I began to think, well, who's gonna make me go to school, go to college, and make sure I have a good life? In that moment, I was experiencing separation and ego death because I was alone and couldn't see my future. I didn't know that at the time. As children, we don't understand what fear is. Sure, we get scared, but that's different. For example, if you're a kid with bad eyesight and you grow to be a student that struggles because you can't see, but you never receive the help, and then you grow into an adult that never quite reaches your full potential. And it all traces back to your childhood when you couldn't get help to see, and it wasn't even your fault. Or when you're a kid, and let's say you get locked in a closet, and then you develop claustrophobia, or you get thrown into a pool and you don't know how to swim, and you never learn how to swim. Studies show babies begin to show signs of fear at about 8 to 12 months, and it's usually in reaction to the adults around them, maybe like me and mommy with the ducks. In 2019, the CDC did research on children ages 3 to 17 years and found 9.4%, approximately 5.8 million kids, had diagnosed anxiety. And then 4.4% of kids, approximately 2.7 million kids, had diagnosed depression. Both of these metrics considerably increasing since the last study in 2012, and this was before the pandemic. They also found that these diagnoses occur in multiples. So if one existed, another one likely existed or was in development. Fear shows up in our lives long before we know what to do with it. And in this phase of life, we're simply too young to know what's happening to us. And if you're not in a safe environment where you can process that fear, you're almost certain to carry it forward unresolved. Our childhood will always be who we are. And as kids, we might be resilient, but we're fragile. In adolescence, I always think of jackass videos when I think of fear, and I don't know why, but I think of kids in shopping carts being pushed by their friends down steep staircases into busy parking lots or ravines, right? Or another person holding a watermelon with an M80 firework inside, waiting for it to explode. Now, were you the friend in the cart, pushing the cart, holding the watermelon, or taking pics and posting from the sidelines? I'm just saying. I wanted to know for this talk what people were thinking, and so I interviewed 30 people between the ages of 25, 75 years old. And I asked them 4 questions. Tell me about a fear you've experienced. How did you know it was fear? Did you resolve it, or are you still struggling through it? And do you wish you would have addressed it differently? I was amazed at what people told me and how much they shared. And the one lesson I learned from it all is that when people need help in life, they often also need community. One of the stories I heard was about a high school student who came from a good home, comfortable living environment, but struggled with their sexual and gender identity. And no matter what they believed, they couldn't believe that the world would ever accept who they truly were. And so after years of loss of autonomy and separation and ego death, they attempted suicide. Now think about it for a minute. Their fears were stronger than their commitment to life. Luckily, they weren't successful. They got a second chance, and with loving family and friends and mental health providers, they were able to have a second chance at a much happier and healthier life. They changed their perception of their fear and found motivation through it. In adolescence, fear looks like many, many things. It takes on many forms. And we're still experiencing so much we don't understand, even though we think we do. We see peer pressure, cyberbullying, broken homes, failing in school, natural disasters, active shooters, life after graduation, and the fear that the authority and agencies that are supposed to be working in our favor are not doing that, and they're not protecting us. Carl E. Pickard, a PhD, wrote an article in November of 2013 for Psychology Today that advises parents, don't tell your kids to don't be afraid. It shuts down the conversation and is completely critical, but instead, talk to your kids and teach them to respect their fear as you respect their fear. Understand its warnings and the fact that all fears have limitations. We just need to know what they are. Use judgment and to understand the scope of that fear, and then brave the best choice, no matter how difficult, and recognize the courage all of this takes. The adult brain is not formed until age 25. Odds are we have all experienced life-altering fear long before that. Fear causes many, many poor decisions in adulthood. And whether consciously or subconsciously, we are choosing a path aligned to that fear, which is hiding our true motivation. In adolescence, we're not quite ready to learn that lesson yet. Now, as we move on to the adult years, and I love these stories, I always imagine the news story of the 90-year-old that's jumping out of a plane for the first time. And they are living their best life. They jump out of the plane, their family's on the ground, totally worried and freaking out. And by the time the older person gets to the ground, they are annoyed by their family members who are being so extra. I don't understand. Now, whatever that elder person might be feeling, it's certainly not mutilation or extinction because they just jumped out of a plane. I myself, I'm not quite there yet. A few years ago, I went to a wellness spa and decided to treat my fear of near heights, 30, 40 feet. I was going to jump off of a telephone pole. Now, I had on a full body harness and a tension rope system. It was completely safe. But in that moment, none of those safety mechanisms protected me from the heart-stopping, brain-piercing fear I experienced. I went through extinction, mutilation, separation, annihilation, devastation, all of those nations, all at one time. It was a lot. I'm still working on that fear too. Several survey respondents mentioned love and relationships in their responses. And I interviewed a man who was gripped in separation ego death because he was afraid to let go of a 24-year love relationship that was no longer good for him. He and his partner's love languages were simply not matched, and neither were their core values in life. And they loved each other very much, but therapy was not an option. And so resentment and deafening silence eventually built up in their relationship. And even though their relationship had survived 24 years, they had great love for one another. He had to be courageous and let go. And through some therapy and discussion at that point, then eventually his spouse agreed. It was excruciating, gut-wrenching separation, ego death. But it was also liberating because he knew he had to get back to himself, and he was motivated to get back to himself. Other survey respondents talk about getting older, losing control of your body and mind, making poor decisions early in life that you know they're going to come back with a vengeance later in life, but you really don't know how they're going to come back. Having anxiety, for example, earlier in life, that never gets addressed. And then as you become an elder, it's now debilitating physically and mentally, and you no longer have the energy to even fight it or address it. Being a smoker in your 40s and deciding to quit at that time, knowing that the consequences might come back in your 70s, but really not understanding how bad they might be. Just imagine not being able to breathe on your own. Or going to the doctor and not being able to handle any bad news because you are completely ill-equipped to deal with anything. Or finally, living in your own home, maybe alone, and looking at those pair of shoes in the corner or thinking about the popcorn in the cabinet being life-ending one day because they may trip or choke you, and you know that your mental and physical capacities are too weak. I have a tip for you. Time is still on your side. In this moment, time is still on your side. The surveys yielded other information. 73% wish they'd gotten help sooner, 67% wish they'd sought professional help, and 63% are still working on their fear. But 80% of those people mention family as a support system. In adulthood, fear looks like many things, starting or ending anything: relationships, changing health, staying poor, losing wealth, caregiving, rejection. But at this stage, we know something's happening to us. The question is, are we going to investigate it? And are we really going to address it if we find something? Now back to the duck. My mother and I were sitting in the car, upright, no seatbelts, it was the 70s. And I was really, really scared and crying. And I remember she asked me, "Do you know why the ducks were chasing you?" And I said, "No." She said, "They were chasing you because they were hungry and you had food." And I said, "Oh, the bread." She said, "Yes, the bread." So they weren't trying to hurt you, they just wanted to eat. And I smiled. And she said, "Now let's go to McDonald's." Because in the 70s, McDonald's cured everything. But in that moment, she was teaching me how to think about my fear and make sense of it, and then try to find a logical way through it. She did a lot of things like that for me in my life before I lost her at age 12. And maybe that's because I entered the world with a little more clarity and a little more courage than the typical 12-year-old. And maybe that's my purpose to you. I stepped into the world with that clarity and courage, wanting to make it stronger and wanting to address my fears head on. And I still have a couple I'm working through, but I feel much better about where I am than where I could have been. Now, by now, I hope you're feeling a little curious. Maybe you want to self-explore. Maybe you're thinking about a fear or two. At least I hope you are. And that's the whole point, to get you to think about it so you can start the journey, get the help, stay on the path, and find your peace. The arc of your life is always yours to draw out. You get to choose at every milestone. No, you do. You really, really do. And we can't change our core, but we can work to understand it better so that it shapes better decisions and outcomes in our lives. Remember to use your resources. You have chosen family and friends, mental health providers, local public health agencies, peer support groups, and if you are ever in a mental health crisis, please call 988. The first step to finding help is likely a friendly search engine away. So give yourself some grace. Give yourself some time and space. Identify your fear, break it down, and find the true mystery and uncover it. And then find your true motivation to go through it. I know it's not easy. I'm not saying it's easy. But grab a chosen family member or two, take them by the hand, and walk through it together. Your better life is waiting on the other side. Thank you.